There was something about the whispers in the village that night. Even though Ardora can't see, she could hear the birds singing her name. Adora's world began in darkness long before dawn broke over Ifiti. Maman Ketch's slippers scuffed close, and Ardora reached out, letting her grandmother's steady hand guide her to the hearth. The cassava was already steaming, its sweet stench weaving through the warm air. In that single scent, Ardora recognized safety, routine, and poverty. The cracks in their bowls, the frayed hem of her only dress, the hush that fell over the market whenever anyone whispered the creditor's name, the man who keeps tally. She knew there was something more attached to her than any other person, but nobody was willing to explain to her. By mid-morning, the debt's shadow had settled like dust over every conversation. Neighbors ducked behind curtained doorways. Even Uncle Emeka, the tailor, paused his needlework to cast worried glances. Ardora felt the tension in the way birds fell silent when she passed and heard it in the tailor's scissors as they clicked closed. She had resisted for months marrying this strange man, but the whole village seemed to be against her until she finally gave in. She hummed an old lullaby, one her mother used to sing, forcing its familiar melody to tame the sudden grip of fear. When dusk came, a stranger arrived. He moved through the gloom with measured steps, sandal straps whispering against the beaten earth. Ardora sensed him before she heard his voice, sliding her fingertips along her grandmother's robe until she found the stranger's darker cloak. He made no introduction, no bending of the head, no unveiling of his face beneath the woven cap. Instead, he placed a sealed scroll in Maman Ketch's trembling hands and announced, "She will marry me at first light." Ardora's throat went dry. "Why me?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm. "To settle what must be settled," he replied, as though repaying debts were as simple as exchanging coins. That night, with only her grandmother's soft sobs for company, Ardora pressed her hand against his cloak and wondered how a single promise, spoken in shadows, could unravel every certainty she'd ever known. The courtyard thrummed with quiet energy long before dawn's first light. Ardora heard the low murmur of voices drifting over the walls, harsh whispers of speculation. Who would come for a blind girl? Is she to be sold like a prized goat? And the soft rustle of borrowed gauze as women stretched red cloth between the trees. Beads clacked against one another in the hands of the tailor's wife, who arranged them in loops around the ropes that served as makeshift pillars. In the center, a battered drum sat poised to mark the ceremony's first heartbeat. Ardora listened as an old neighbor praised the color of her wrapper, bright enough to blind the sun, she joked, and she offered a teasing laugh in return, though her chest tightened at the thought of tomorrow. She felt the weight of Maman Ketch's shawl slip from her shoulders and, on instinct, reached for the woman's hand. The familiar texture grounded her, a reminder that even in this whirlwind of silk and suspicion, she was not alone. Somewhere close by, a goat bleated its protest, perhaps startled by a stray ribbon or by the sudden pounding of footsteps. Laughter rippled through the gathered crowd, and Ardora let herself be carried by it, hoping for a moment of lightness before the solemn vow. The drum's stick tapped once, soft and steady, calling them to form a circle. She felt warm breath as each villager bowed their head, then the snap of a braid being unwound as bridesmaids prepared her hairless scalp for the ceremonial beads. Aurora leaned into the circle of eager faces and offered a grin sharper than any knife. "If I'm going to be traded off," she quipped, voice bright as the beaded necklace brushing her collarbone, "at least find someone who appreciates rare livestock." The crowd tittered, some with relief, others with uneasy glances. She felt the ripple of amusement, soft laughter that fluttered through the courtyard like moth wings, and for a heartbeat, her dread loosened its grip. Even Uncle Emeka cracked a smile, the tension in his shoulders easing as though her humor were a talisman against the unknown. Long after the guests departed and the red cloth lay limp in the moonlight, Aurora sat at the edge of her mat, fingers entwined around Maman Ketch's. The shadows pooled around them, and the only sound was the distant croak of frogs. Adeora's voice was firm in the hush. "I will not be a bargain," she said, each word a quiet promise. The old woman's hand trembled in hers, and for a moment, Aurora felt the weight of every whispered debt and every desperate hope resting on that vow. In the silence that followed, neither needed to speak again. Her resolve filled the dark. He lingered just beyond the circle of lantern light, the edge of his robe brushing the earth as he watched her. Adeora's laughter rang clear, carrying a note of defiance he hadn't expected, her voice light but unyielding, like wind against stone. He traced the curve of her shoulders beneath the borrowed beads, the way she held herself when the drum tapped its first beat, stubborn grace etched into every movement. Each jest she sent at her own fate drew another flicker of surprise across his hidden face. Later, when the courtyard became empty and the only witness was the moon, he pressed a palm to the rough timber and exhaled a breath he'd held since before dawn. "Honor," he murmured, so faint that the night breeze almost swallowed it. "Atonement." His fingers curled around an unseen weight at his chest, as though he carried the sins of another life beneath his ribs. The hush around him felt as complete as Adora's world, yet far more jagged, the edges of guilt and obligation cutting into him, demanding repayment in ways he'd only just begun to understand. Uncle Emeka's hands trembled as he draped the wrapper over Adora's shoulders, too long by half, the fabric's red so vivid it felt as though a sunset had been boiled into cloth. He muttered under his breath, tugging at the hem, attempting to pin it into place. "Here," Adora teased, tilting her head, "you need spectacles, uncle. Or perhaps a compass to find the end of this thing." The tailor froze, then let out a burst of laughter so genuine that even the women hovering nearby paused their bead stringing to grin. "My eyes aren't what they used to be," he admitted, "but I swear, this wrapper has a mind of its own." He finally managed to fold the excess into a neat tuck, clapping his hands together in triumph. Before the sun had peeked over the horizon, the stranger led a dark car to the gate. Adora settled onto its broad back without stirrups. The earth was a steady drum, a farewell to the familiar paths she'd known all her life. As they approached the city, the rhythm around her fractured into a cacophony, car horns blaring in angry bursts, engines gurgling like throats clearing, vendors hawking bread. Plantain. Fresh fish. In rolling accents she'd never heard. Electricity hummed overhead, a high wire melody, and somewhere above the din a siren wailed, urgent, insistent. Adora inhaled sharply, tasting exhaust and pavement on the breeze. He guided her through the swarm of bodies, his hand firm on her elbow as she stepped between motorcycles and pedestrians. With each stride, she matched her pace to his, first the left foot's click, then the right, an echo of his gait. When a vendor's cart rattled too close, she murmured, "Too near," and he angled her around the wheel with a gentle pivot. In that swirl of noise and motion, Adora offered soft commentary, louder here, footsteps slow, discovering this new world one sound at a time, trusting that even in the heart of chaos, she could find her way. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and Aurora stepped onto a floor so polished it felt like walking on glass, even her cane tapped a muted echo. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something floral she couldn't name. Somewhere overhead, hidden speakers whispered a synthetic melody, each note too perfect to be anything but designed. She lifted her hand and let her fingers hover above a smooth banister of cool glass, marveling at its impossible straightness. When the stranger guided her toward the elevator, its doors parted like the opening of a secret chamber. She placed both hands lightly on his arm as it hummed to life, the lifts ascent a single continuous breath. The soft wood deepened in her chest, and her pulse hammered in time with the machinery. Above them, the city's heartbeat throbbed through the walls, cars and voices and distant sirens. Yet inside this metal tube, there was only that low, unbroken vibration. As the elevator slowed, Aurora steadied herself. She drew in a breath, tasting the cool, conditioned air. Who was this man who moved so confidently between worlds, her dusty village and this fortress of silence and steel? She felt the weight of that question tighten around her as the doors opened again, revealing another floor of polished floors and hidden music. In his steady grip, she realized that every unfamiliar sound in this place carried a question. Not just who he was, but who she might become under his watch. Every evening, the stranger softened the apartment's sharp angles with flickering candles. Aurora would drift into bed as he arranged them in clusters on the windowsill, their warm glow stirring shadows that danced like distant memories. He sat beside her, voice low, reading from worn classics, Akib, Morrison, and each carefully chosen passage seemed to bridge the gap between her world and his. When he handed her a single rose, its petals velvet against her fingertips, she inhaled its heady scent and, for a moment, believed she stood barefoot beside a garden rather than on gleaming tile. Still, every kindness was edged with mystery. When she asked his name, he only offered a faint smile and a sip of steaming tea. If she inquired about his fortune, he would change the subject to her favorite lullaby or the story behind one of her scars. At times, Aurora felt swaddled in care. At others, she felt adrift, stranded in luxury without knowing the deepest truth of the man who wove comfort around her. Each loving gesture, each borrowed line from a novel, each flower's fragrance, felt like a gift and a warning. She was meant to trust him, but she was never meant to know him fully. The rain came suddenly, as if the sky had cracked open. Thunder rolled over the city, and fat drops pelted the pavement in hurried rhythm. They had been walking, him guiding her carefully along the edge of a quiet street, when the downpour forced them beneath the narrow mouth of a building's awning. He snapped open a small umbrella, barely wide enough for two. She pressed close, her shoulder brushing his. For a long moment, they said nothing. Only the hiss of rain, the steady patter on the umbrella's taut skin. Then he spoke, quietly. "I owe you more than you know." Aurora tilted her head. "Not money." He hesitated. "No, not money." She could feel it then, not just in his voice, but in the way his arms stiffened beside hers. There was a tremble in his silence, something buried. Not obligation, but remorse. As if he were not simply fulfilling a promise, but seeking forgiveness for something she could not name. "What is it you owe me?" she asked, her voice sharper now, cutting through the veil of rain. He didn't answer. Just stared out at the wet world, jaw tight. The umbrella's edge dripped steadily. Aurora folded her hands in her lap, heart pounding in her ears. She sensed him pull away slightly, as though retreating into a room she could never enter. Fear stirred in her chest, not of harm, but of being kept in the dark again, of being the last to know the truth of her own life. And yet, something else bloomed alongside it, a flicker of trust, tender and maddening. Because even in his silence, he had stayed beside her. And part of her, against every better instinct, wanted to believe he would tell her, eventually. The gala was a world of shimmer and spectacle. Music spilled like liquid gold from a string quartet tucked behind velvet curtains, and the scent of wine, waxed floors, and perfume layered the air until it almost choked. Aurora, clad in a gown too soft to be real, was led gently by the elbow toward the center of the hall, up a few steps, onto a platform that felt too large beneath her feet. The crowd hushed. She could feel their attention like heat on her skin. Somewhere beyond the lights, a familiar footstep halted. She knew it by rhythm now, sure, even, burdened. The man who had brought her here was watching. The announcer's voice echoed, formal and fluid. "Tonight, our anonymous host dedicates this event to those who have risen beyond circumstance." But Aurora had stopped listening. She stepped forward, the platform creaking softly beneath her, and lifted her chin. "I don't want your lights or your speeches," she said, her voice cutting through the hush like a bell. "I want the truth." A murmur rolled through the crowd. She stretched out her hand toward the space she knew he occupied. "No more shadows. No more secrets. If I was brought here to be paraded, then let me see the man who did it. With my own kind of sight." The silence thickened. Even the music had stopped. Then, slow footsteps across marble. Closer. The air shifted as he stepped onto the platform beside her. For a heartbeat, she could hear his breathing, steady, but heavy with what he carried. "Show me," she whispered. "Please." And this time, he didn't turn away. The moment was a held breath, suspended in the hush that followed Ardora's demand. Then came the slow scrape of fabric, the soft rustle of movement, and the cap, the ever-present veil of anonymity, slipped away. The lights above caught his face in full for the first time. Chiseled features, eyes shadowed by years of solitude, the unmistakable presence of power cloaked in humility. The room erupted, not with applause, but with gasps. Whispers hissed like steam through the crowd. Chukwudi Eze. The Eze. No one's seen him in years. He's a ghost. He stood unmoved, gaze fixed only on her. But Ardora's breath caught in her throat. The name rang through her like a bell tolling over a forgotten grave. Stories of Chukwudi Eze had reached even the remote paths of Ifiti, the boy who vanished from school, the tycoon who never gave interviews, the man whose wealth was matched only by his secrecy. And he was the one who had brought her here? Her hand trembled as it slipped from the crook of his arm. Her feet, once so sure of his step, now hesitated. "You," she started, then faltered. "You're not who you said. Not even close." The crowd watched, breathless. Chukwudi's voice was barely audible. "I never lied. I just never told." But the truth had its own gravity. Ardora stepped back, stunned by the weight of revelation. Her world, once defined by sound, scent, and touch, spinning now on the axis of a name. His name. The one that had shaped lives from a distance, and now stood within arm's reach. The room was still humming with whispers when Chukwudi stepped closer, the crowd now just a distant blur around them. He didn't reach for her this time. Instead, his voice, low, stripped of ceremony, cut through the heavy air. "I came to Ifiti not to rescue you," he said, "but because I had to face what I did." Ardora stood rooted, her fingers curled into her palm. "What are you saying?" He paused, as if choosing between mercy and truth, and chose the latter. 15 years ago, he began, my company needed land. Fast. Cheap. We bought your village from corrupt hands, cleared trees, rerouted rivers, and left nothing but dust and debt. I never went there. Never saw the people. I signed contracts, approved bulldozers, and made my first billion. Ardora's lips parted, but no words came. He looked away briefly, then met her again. "I didn't know your name then. I didn't know your family. But when I found out what my success had cost, what I had taken, I couldn't erase it. So I went back. Disguised. Hoping to do something, to fix something." Her breath trembled in her chest. So that marriage, that kindness, it was guilt. He didn't deny it. "It was an offering," he said. "A poor one. I thought, if I could carry your burden, if I could give you something back." Ardora turned her face away, the weight of it all pressing into her like the heat before a storm. Her childhood, her blindness, her grandmother's pain, the world he had burned was the same one he now tried to rebuild with roses and literature. "You didn't save me," she whispered. "You saved yourself." He took one step closer, but not another. "Maybe. But I fell in love with the part of you that never needed saving. That's the truth too." And with that, the room's silence deepened, not out of awe, but because a fracture had formed, wide and raw, between intention and consequence. Between love, and the ruins it was built upon. The floor beneath Ardora felt suddenly unsteady, too wide, too loud. The weight of the crowd's attention, its silence, its awe, pressed in like heat. She staggered to the edge of the platform, her hand outstretched for balance. The velvet of her gown caught on her heel, but she didn't stop. Somewhere in the distance, camera shutters clicked like insects. Gasps turned to murmurs. Her cane tapped once, then again, a sharp echo against marble that cut through the hum of whispers. Tears had already begun to streak her cheeks, warm against the cold polish of her composure. She descended the steps blindly, her fingers trembling as they gripped the rail. Every sound, the pop of a champagne cork, the muttered God, she didn't know, the whir of artificial air overhead, spun around her in a cruel carousel. Behind her, Chukwudi's footsteps broke into a run. "Ardora, please," he called. But she didn't stop. He caught up with her in a narrow corridor lit by hidden sconces and scattered with roses meant for celebration. The rich scent clung to the air like irony. "I didn't know how else to face you," he said, breathless. "I didn't know how to." "You should have told me," she said, gripping her cane like a lifeline. "From the first day. You stood in my grandmother's compound. You heard our hunger. And you still said nothing. I didn't want to hurt you." "You already had," she said, turning her face toward him, her voice quieter now, but sharper. "You don't get to make yourself a savior out of the ashes you made." He reached for her, hesitated. His hand dropped. The silence returned, but this one wasn't tender. It was final. Ardora raised her chin, and with steady steps, walked deeper into the corridor alone. Her cane struck the ground with purpose, and behind her, the man with all the answers was left without words. The road to Ifiti was dustier than Ardora remembered. The wind carried the scent of cracked earth and old grief, and the air buzzed not with celebration this time, but with the weight of returned truths. As she stepped into the compound where her childhood still lingered in the corners, where the clay walls seemed to slump under the burden of years, she felt it. The tension. The whispers tucked into every pause between greetings. Maman Ketchi sat by the hearth, hunched and still, her wrapper faded like an old memory. She didn't look up when Ardora approached, but her hands trembled as they turned a yam over the fire. "You knew," Ardora said simply, no hello, no smile. "Just that." The old woman flinched. "Barely. I didn't know everything." "You knew enough." Ardora's voice cracked, fury folded inside each word. "You knew he was rich. You knew he came with papers. And you let me go." Maman Ketchi turned slowly. Her eyes were red, but dry. "I let you go so you could live. By marrying the man who ruined our land." Ardora snapped. "He crushed our farms, left us begging. And you gave me to him like a peace offering." "I thought he was sent by God," Maman Ketchi whispered. "I thought he had come to return what the world had taken from us." Ardora stepped back, winded by the absurdity of it. "He took everything," she said, "and then offered me candles and books as compensation." The fire crackled. Maman Ketchi finally looked up. "Do you think I didn't ask questions? Do you think I wasn't afraid? But there was no food. No future. Just you and that sickness in my chest that comes every morning before I rise." Silence again. "I was trying to save you, Ardora." Ardora knelt, fingers tracing the edge of the hearth. "And all the while, you handed me to the man who broke our world." The silence between them stretched, taut as thread. There was no clean villain here, only wounds passed hand to hand, generation to generation. Ardora didn't cry. Her heart was already too full for tears. But deep inside her, something shifted, not forgiveness, not yet, but the knowledge that betrayal had not come from one man alone. The first rains came early that year, washing the dust from Ifiti cracked roads and cooling the anger still curled beneath Ardora's ribs. The village, once nearly silent in its sorrow, hummed now with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and cautious hope. Chukwudi didn't come with cameras this time. No entourage, no velvet words. Just sleeves rolled to his elbows, dust on his trousers, and notebooks in his hand. He stood beneath the old baobab tree, its branches a little thinner now, and waited. It was Maman Ketchi who brought the message. "He wants to see you," she said, not unkindly. "But only if you choose." Ardora had already heard the murmurs. That new wells were being dug where the streams had run dry. That roofs were being replaced. That children with threadbare shoes were holding letters of scholarship, signed in his own name. She found him near the newly framed schoolhouse, speaking with the carpenter. He heard her cane first, then turned, removing his cap out of habit. "I'm not here to thank you," she said without preamble. "I didn't expect thanks. I'm not here to forget. I don't want you to." They stood in silence for a moment, the wood-scented wind threading between them. Then she tilted her head. "If you're serious about rebuilding," she said, "you don't need a figurehead. You need a guide." He nodded slowly. "Then be my guide. Help me do it right. Tell me what you want done, not what I think should be done." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tested him. Over weeks, she pushed back on every glossy plan, every shiny proposal. No to the concrete church. Yes to the roofless market stalls that can grow into something. No speeches. Let people see you lifting bags of cement, not microphones. No naming the school after me, or yourself. And Chukwudi listened. He changed the blueprints. He hauled bricks beside the masons. He stood under the hot sun and nodded when the elders corrected him. He didn't flinch when Ardora mocked his city hands or made him eat poorly spiced egusi stew from her grandmother's dented pot. One afternoon, after she dismissed him yet again with a wave of her cane and a clipped, "Come back when you're not pretending," he returned the next morning without a word, and simply got to work. That was when something shifted. Not love. Not yet. But a respect formed in the dust and sweat, something that wasn't born from guilt, but earned through labor. For the first time, Ardora began to wonder if redemption, like trust, was less about grand gestures, and more about what a man was willing to build when no one was looking. The first time Ardora laughed, really laughed, since the unmasking, it was because of a goat. Not just any goat. The same goat that once stormed her wedding in the village, scattering beads and a pending dignity. Now, it wandered the manicured lawns of Chukwudi's estate like a monarch, head high, chewing imported hibiscus flowers as though it had been born to luxury. Adaora stood on the veranda, head tilted as she listened to its familiar bleats. "You brought him here?" she asked, trying not to smile. Chukwudi, crouched nearby attempting to repair a fence the goat had knocked over, looked up sheepishly. "He followed us from the village." "He followed you. You're the one with the endless yams. He's a good judge of character." Adaora snorted, then let the laughter rise and fall, light and unguarded. It startled her how easily it came, how sweetly it settled between them. That evening, a soft knock came at her door. When she opened it, something warm and furry leaned against her legs. "A dog?" she asked, surprised. "A partner," Chukwudi said. "Trained in Lagos. His name is Beacon. He's yours, if you want him." The dog sat obediently, tail gently swaying. Adaora bent, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out. The animal didn't flinch. It simply waited. She whispered, "Hello, Beacon," and it was like being seen in a new way. In the weeks that followed, the shadows between her and Chukwudi softened. They still argued, but now with teasing smirks. They still walked carefully, but now toward, not around, each other. One night, they shared suya from a roadside stall, her fingers greasy, his lips stained with pepper. A vendor sang high-life music behind them, and Aurora hummed along, badly off-key. Chukwudi joined in, worse. "You're tone-deaf," she teased. "I'm charming," he corrected. Another time, caught in a sudden Lagos downpour, they ran barefoot across the terrace. The rain drenched them in seconds, turning her braids to ropes and his shirt to a second skin. Instead of shelter, she pulled him into a spin, clumsy, free, full of something like joy. They danced. Not for the cameras. Not for apology. Just because it felt good. In those small, unvarnished moments, between a stubborn goat's bleats and the warm loyalty of a dog named Beacon, they began to build something more honest than forgiveness. They began to build something that, just maybe, resembled home. The sun was kind that day, mellow, golden, settling softly over Ifiti as drums beat in celebration. The new community center stood tall at the heart of the village, red roof gleaming, murals bright with children's fingerprints, and laughter echoing through its halls. Aurora stood at the edge of the crowd, one hand resting on Beacon's sturdy head, the other lightly gripping her cane. It had taken months of debate, designing, arguing, rebuilding. But it was done. And more than that, it felt right. Chukwudi stood a short distance away, not beside her, but not far. He knew now that proximity didn't guarantee closeness. It had to be earned. The crowd pressed in as Aurora stepped forward to give her speech. A hush fell over the field. Just as she began, her cane struck something with a hollow thunk beneath the shade of the ancient tamarind tree. She paused, furrowed her brow, and tapped again. Definitely not stone. Wood. Curious murmurs rippled through the villagers as a few young boys helped uncover what turned out to be a rusted tin box, wrapped in layers of cloth. Someone whispered, "It's a time capsule." Someone else added, "Must be 2 decades old." With trembling hands, Aurora unwrapped it. Inside were sealed letters, still folded neatly despite the years. She recognized the handwriting on one of them, delicate, looping. Her mother's. Addressed to her father. And beside them, tucked in an old cloth bag, were several dusty lottery tickets. The village held its breath. Chukwudi moved closer, brows raised. "Let me check the date," he offered quietly. He pulled out his phone, opened a browser, searched the winning numbers from 20 years ago. One matched. Perfectly. A roar went through the crowd, but Aurora only blinked slowly, processing. Her voice was low, steady. "My father, he must have played once, for fun. He never even told us. He died thinking we had nothing." Maman Ketchi, wide-eyed, clutched her chest. That ticket could have changed everything. Aurora folded the letter in her hand, pressed it to her heart. Maybe. But maybe we wouldn't be here. She looked toward the center, children running through its halls, an elder teaching 2 girls to weave mats, a boy sketching on the wall. She looked at Chukwudi, silent, uncertain. She looked at the village. And then she smiled. "I think we still won." She turned toward the podium, her voice now rising with quiet power. "This isn't a story of wealth lost or found. It's the story of people who endured, blind but not broken, poor but not powerless." The crowd erupted into applause, but she stood still, letting the weight of the moment settle. That forgotten ticket had been buried like so many truths. But its discovery didn't undo the journey. They had built something deeper than wealth. Behind her, Chukwudi whispered, "You're full of surprises." She turned her face toward him. "So are you." And together, beneath the tamarind's shade, they stood, not as a billionaire and a blind girl, not as debtor and savior, but as something new. As equals. Weeks after the unveiling of the time capsule, Ifiti buzzed with something more potent than surprise. It buzzed with possibility. The Lottery Commission verified the ticket. The prize, untouched for 20 years, had been held in trust, quietly growing. And now, it was coming home. Not to a single person, but to a village. To a people who had survived, not with riches, but with will. Ardora stood beneath the tamarind tree again, her fingers tracing the bark as elders and lawyers gathered under makeshift canopy nearby. The news reporters tried to make it about the money. Ardora didn't let them. This, she said to the crowd gathered before the old village square, isn't a miracle. It's just a correction. Late, but welcome. With a community vote, they agreed. The funds would go to long-term development, schools, clinics, irrigation, skill centers. Not a naira was to be wasted on vanity. This time, Ifiti would write its own future. Chukwudi watched from the sidelines, his arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line. He'd offered to help manage the fund, to bring in experts, consultants. But Ardora had smiled, kindly, firmly, and said, "You've done enough. Let us take it from here." She moved back into her father's renovated house with Maman Kechi. The estate in Lagos remained open to her, but she chose instead to return to the sounds and textures that had shaped her. Sometimes, Chukwudi visited, quietly, without fanfare. They'd sit by the fire, sharing roasted corn and stories. The romance that once hovered between them now matured into something steadier, unpressured by obligation. One evening, as the last embers glowed, he spoke softly. "I came to fix what I broke." "You did," she replied. "And now it's time I build without you holding the beams." He nodded, understanding. "But," she added, her voice like woven silk, "you can still plant a tree next to mine." It wasn't a declaration of love, nor a rejection. It was a hand extended, not as a guest in his world, not as a girl who had been bought, but as a woman who had reclaimed her story. Together, they began drafting new blueprints. Not for palaces, but for people. Not for apologies, but for progress. They walked side by side, not blind to each other's past, but fully awake to what the future could hold. In Ifiti, under the watchful branches of the tamarind tree, Ardora's journey, once dark, uncertain, forced, came full circle. She had been married in the dark. But now, finally, she lived in the light.